Well, let's see. I will go ahead and get started. So thank you, everyone, for joining us today for the steering committee meeting. This is our third meeting, our second virtual meeting. Today we are going to go over a sort of summary of what we've been doing with engagement and what we're doing moving forward from here, and hear some of your thoughts on that. The focus of today's meeting will be around housing, and HRNA, Philip and Sarah will speak with you, give an overview of sort of what we heard from your great input you gave on that survey and at the last meeting related to the different issues related to housing affordability in the city. And well, they'll begin a discussion about housing tools, different housing tools that might be used as we look at how to address those issues. And so we sent the presentation ahead of time, and there were some questions interspersed throughout that, and they'll be leading you through a discussion as they go today. We will have time for comments at the end by members of the public who are joining us, other members who are not on the steering committee. There are currently 13 of you on the call. Thank you for being here today. We welcome you to submit questions in the Q&A box or the chat box, but we will probably be holding most questions until the Q&A portion at the end of the meeting, or toward the last 15 minutes of the meeting. Before we really get into the meat of everything today, it felt important to us that we recognize the sort of situation we're in right now. We met in April at the beginning of a surge of a pandemic, and that's still a concern, certainly, very much so. And as we're all very aware, we're having this meeting during a surge of protests and yet another resurgence of these discussions about racial inequity in our country. And so we know these issues that underlie these protests are not new issues, but we know that these events are probably weighing on many of you as they are on us. And so we know, it might be difficult to concentrate in the meeting tonight, but we're really glad you're here. Thank you for taking time to be here. We, from the beginning of this process, have been committed to speaking openly with you and everyone, and honestly, about the need to address inequity, racial inequity, income inequity, inequity in access to housing and opportunities, and other aspects. And so we think it's crucially important to keep talking about these issues. So again, just thank you for being here. And just recognizing the sort of heavyweight of all of this, we thought we would follow the lead of sort of the council and take a moment of silence before we begin our meeting. So I would just invite everyone to take a few seconds now of silence, and then we'll get started. Thank you. And we'll get started with our meeting, but I really appreciate you doing that with us. We sent along a summary of some engagement, the engagement activities we've been undertaking, and that included a summary of what we have been doing in terms of our strategies, the different discussions we've been having, as well as a discussion of the survey results that we had seen as of the time that we sent out the materials to you last week. I think at that time, let me see, I'm just pulling it up here. When we sent it to you, there were, I think 129 responses, and now we're up to 250 on the survey. But we have more people we want to hear from in addition to that. So Latoya, would you like to give an overview of how engagement's been going?
Sure, thanks, Jenny. Just give me 1 second. I'm just shifting something. Okay. So hi, everyone. Good afternoon or early evening. Thanks for joining us. So just to summarize what's been going on over the last couple of weeks, as Jenny mentioned, we shifted gears in light of COVID and our inability to travel. So over the course of the last three to 4 weeks, probably 3-ish weeks around now, we've had a couple of different activities going on to kick off this engagement process and really to start connecting with residents in Charlottesville, as well as starting to put information out about what the Cville Plans Together process is and what folks can expect from it going forward over the next several months. We started off with the launch of the project website, cvilleplans.together.com, and have been continuing to promote that website and divert people to the website to get information about this process. We also launched a series of webinars. So we did 3 webinars, all the exact same webinar, but they were live. So we had live Q&A for folks to be able to participate online to learn about what this process is and how they can participate in it going forward. All of those webinars are actually saved on the project website for folks who did not participate in those. So just a reminder, you can check those out, either the recording or just download a PDF of the presentation. We've had 5 small group discussions thus far. We have 1 scheduled for this week, and I think we've just published dates for an additional 6 small group discussions that will happen over the next couple of weeks. Just so you kind of know where numbers have gone, webinars, we've had anywhere from 25 to 40-ish people participating in each of the webinars. The small group discussions have ranged from about 5 to 13 people for each small group discussion, and those have been facilitated conversations. We also have the community survey that's active. We initially, so I'm going to ask you to go on mute if you've got some background noise. Thank you. We've got the community survey that is open, available online at the website. We are also looking at making hard copies of that available to folks who might prefer or not have a choice but to do it via hard copy if they've got technology access issues. We were going to run that through June 10th. We are planning to extend that to the latter part of June. So we've had a pretty robust start for the virtual engagement series, but we are continuing to obviously develop more of these virtual engagement tools while we're still unable to travel to Charlottesville, as well as starting to leverage some of the existing networks in Charlottesville to get the word out more about what's happening with this process and how people can participate. A couple of things that I do want to highlight, we've had many conversations over the last 3 weeks with different people and different organizations in Charlottesville trying to tap into the existing networks to get this word out. Just a few quick points. We have talked with FAR and CRHA about getting printed materials pushed out to their residents so they can also participate in the survey and be part of this process. Chantel, we've been talking with you about looping into some of your work and some of the events that are happening later in the month to make sure that we can get the word out to some of the folks that might be participating in the food resource programs that you're active with. I know we've recently been back in touch with IRC about collaborating on some translation opportunities for some of our materials. Our materials right now are available in English and Spanish. And we were connected to a couple of additional folks at IRC about translations in, I believe, Dari and Arabic. So we're working through that collaboration right now. And finally, just back to our small groups, Lisa also helped us to organize a handful of African-American homeowners in Charlottesville for one of our earlier privately organized small group conversations. So I wanted to highlight those just so you can see a diversity of what's going on. I say on the ground, it's virtual and on the ground. Again, we are trying to continue to leverage as many different networks within the steering committee and also within Greater Charlottesville as we possibly can in this process. Jenny, have I left anything out that you wanted to make sure I highlighted?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I guess the one thing I would note is one question we've been getting is, what is our goal for how many people we want to hear from? And it's a good question, and I'm glad people have been bringing it up. And we don't have specific numbers to share with you today. We have had one goal of working to ensure that we're hearing from on the survey when we're getting demographic data and we compare it to the overall Charlottesville population. We want it to be representative of the different neighborhoods, different sort of the race, ethnicity breakdown, income breakdown in the city. We want it to be reflective of that, the overall breakdown. So that is one goal we have, but we are working toward sort of what that means for a number of responses, because we know that's something that's helpful to others to help track as well. So I just wanted to point that out. But with those items, you know, we've been working with some of you already. We've talked with a lot of you on different discussions about how we can be reaching more people. But I would open it up to you right now to say sort of two questions. One would be, you know, are you hearing anything about this process? Do people seem to know this is going on? And I know you're obviously a part of the steering committee, so you know what's going on. But if you've heard from anyone else, we'd be interested to know. And then also just recognizing the constraints we're under, you know, do you see other opportunities for how we can be getting both the information out to people that this is going on, here's what a comprehensive plan is, here's what we're trying to do, and also get their responses on the survey, or encourage them to participate in discussions. So I'd welcome anyone to unmute if you have any thoughts to share about those items.
Latoya.
Oh, let me mute Latoya for a second.
Sorry, I was trying to make sure it was not a steering committee member that could not get on calling me.
Oh, got it. Okay.
Sorry about that.
No worries. So any thoughts about this, about engagement? Again, I know we've already talked with a lot of you about it, so no need to, you know, don't feel you need to reiterate things we've already been talking about. We are working on a lot of new strategies as well.
Hi, this is Chip Boyles with the Planning District Commission. I guess I have heard a good bit of feedback, and it's mostly been in group settings. And I would offer that may be a way of trying to identify some larger groups. Conversations of this, of people's knowledge and participation, or with some Chamber of Commerce meetings I've attended. I'm also a member of the Charlottesville Area Alliance, which is an age-friendly group, which is very interested, and they're aware. But reaching out directly, I think, to any of those types of groups would be a big help, much easier than trying to go out individually.
Yeah, thank you, Chip. That is something we have been doing. We've been reaching out to people both to say, you know, how can we best share this information with your members if they're a group, but also, you know, how can we best engage people in these discussions. So we are organizing some additional small group discussions and whatnot with some of these groups. And I think we have discussed with the chamber, but we do need to check back with them about that. And before we go on, sorry, I realized I just wanted to make sure everyone's aware. We are recording the meeting as we have in the past, and we'll be posting it. Just a heads up for that. Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt any other thoughts anyone else had.
Have you tried communicating with the churches like Mount Zion, First African American Baptist, and First Baptist West Main, and Ebenezer?
Yes, I believe, sorry, Latoya may have disappeared here. I believe Latoya has reached out to some of the churches, and she has reached out to some organizations Yeah, do you want to go ahead?
Sure. So I've started reaching out to several of the churches. I've reached out to, actually as of today, the Cville Clergy Collective was able to find an email for them, which I know a number of parishes are attached to that. I know we've had prior discussions with Impact as well. We also got some resources through a contact at Habitat that we're looking into. So it's a combination. We're working with the larger organizations that are collectives of multiple houses of worship, as well as doing, I'm literally plugging through a sheet right now, going through probably about 30, 40 different houses of worship to try to make sure that we're tapping into all of the religious networks as well.
Have you tried tapping into Incarnation and their huge Hispanic congregation?
I don't know if we've reached out to them yet, but I believe someone did mention them to us, and I think they are on our list to contact if we haven't already.
Correct. Yeah, I don't think we've reached out to them yet, but they are on the list. So we'll make sure.
Sheila
You said
Hurley would be
Yes.
a person.
You got it. Okay.
Yeah,
I'm gonna
I believe
work on bringing-
she was the one who mentioned it to us as well.
Sure. I'm going to go off while I bring Jaquana on, so I'll be right back.
Okay.
I think Pastor Litz has given some great suggestions. You all haven't, we didn't get the data, but is there a breakdown by language, like how many have been filling out the survey in Spanish? And if it's been 0 or very little, maybe we have some work to do in that department.
Oh yeah, we absolutely do. I mean, we just published the Spanish version of the survey, I think the middle of last week. And so I believe it is 0. We need, that's something we're actively working on, pushing out.
And then in terms of like folks hearing about it, they're just now like really learning and hearing about it. I think all the stuff that's happened, you know, in our world is kind of putting a hamper on everything that we're doing. So it would be nice to see like maybe some extension of the survey. I think you asked earlier, like how many is a good number. And I don't know how folks on this call feel, but I personally think we could easily get past 1,000, you know, if there was a good push on it. And just the fact that you said that we're already up to 200, given all that's been in the media, given like the launch and, you know, all this extreme circumstances, we definitely should be aiming for at least 1,000 survey responses. That doesn't seem undoable to me, but I don't know, maybe that's wrong.
I like to aim high. I'm with you on wanting to see as much as we can get. But that's, like I said, we'll be thinking through that. And, you know, we're looking at how sort of different methodologies people have used, but we'll share that with everyone if we do sort of set a goal, and we'd love to get feedback on that. Let's see, recognizing it's 4:20.
There,
Oh, go ahead, Joe.
so there are other groups like that you probably should be, not probably, but you should be reaching out to, which is, you know, the organization like Home to Hope.
Yes, we are having discussions with Home to Hope in the coming weeks.
And OAR.
With OAR? Can you?
Yeah, Offender Aid and Restoration.
Oh,
is
thank you.
where when people are coming back, have to pay whatever. There's a lot of clients that go through that. Social services. I mean, it's a lot of ways that you can do it because, you know, you know, Chip's idea is one, but a lot of our folks or my peers doesn't sit at the table that Chip and other people sit at, and so everybody has to be a part of it. You know, so I just want to make sure that even the youth, you know, school is not in. How are you getting the youth involved?
Yeah,
so
sorry. Go ahead.
You know, with the stuff that's happening, you know, there are young people who are taken to the streets, you know, like Zy Bryant, you know, who's talking to her? we need to find young people who needs to be a part of this, because this is going to be their world.
Yes.
And so I just want to make sure, I agree with Chantel. I think we should extend it, and we should aim high to make sure everybody is having input into this.
Thanks, Joy. I thank you for mentioning, like I said, we've been in touch with the Home to Hope group, and we'll reach out to OAR. And we had a discussion actually just this morning. Latoya and I sat in on a meeting with the schools and talked about how we can work with them to reach out to not only families, but also potentially get some student groups on board. So they're going to be sending us some additional thoughts on that. But I appreciate that you also think that's a priority, because that is something we've been thinking about a lot. And especially as, kids have been doing this virtual schooling. They are used to having these discussions like this, and we'd love to have them on some face-to-face calls in addition to, responding to things like the survey, which we also welcome.
And also to add, Barbara Brown Wilson worked with some youth this summer who Audrey Oliver, she's on the call, was working to do some work in the low-income community where they're doing some redevelopment. I would definitely like to make sure that anybody who touched a youth or is involved with a youth, the City of Promise, the West Haven Nursing Clinic, that's another point. The West Haven Nursing Clinic is there in one of our public housing sites. And that's another way of trying to reach folks. And so, be careful what you ask for, because I'm going to give it to you.
No, I'm glad. These are all people, we have Sarad is on my list, formerly of City of Promise, and the current folks as well. I believe we had someone from West Haven Nursing Clinic on one of our small group discussions as well. So we'll reach out to her. I appreciate all of these. I'm happy to open a box and get a lot of responses. Thank you for that.
If you're going to reopen the survey, I'd suggest that you reissue it to every representative of the neighborhood associations with specific requests that they distribute to their neighborhood members.
Well, just to clarify, we haven't closed the survey at all. We're just it was originally planned to be open through the 10th, and now we've extended it to the 24th.
Okay.
And
whatever. But I would just worth a second go round with the neighborhood associations again with the. I know I got it and forwarded it on so that it would get distributed, but there wasn't a specific, please send this to each of your members, like a specific request for a second opportunity.
Diane, I actually literally today, because I just got I was able to get an updated neighborhood contact list on Friday from the city.
Okay, great.
So today I literally 2 hours ago just sent out a message to all of the neighborhood association leaders based on the current information. So we had some outdated information.
Great. Okay.
So everyone should have it now. We'll make sure to do another push before the survey closes.
Yeah, because we get bombarded with stuff, and I would do it again.
Lost in the sauce. Yeah.
I will also ask. I would also like to ask. Go ahead. I would also like to ask that the 22nd maybe you need to extend it a little bit longer, because there's a lot that is going on this week.
Yeah.
People are just going on with their lives, but some of us are not going on with our lives because it does impact us and we are paying attention. And so you might want to extend it. You have the pandemic and now you have another pandemic. So you may want to extend it beyond the 22nd. I'm just throwing that out to the committee.
Yeah, and that has been brought up to us. We know there are some events that are occurring after that point as well. So we're trying to balance wanting to keep it open to get as many responses as we can up front, but also wanting to get responses so that we can sort of not move forward from there, but then go to the next step and say, here's what we heard. Does this reflect what you think is to be true? And then how should this impact the plan? You know, we want to make sure people are able to move forward and see how their input is impacting the plan as well in sort of a timely fashion. But I completely agree. There is a lot going on and we need to consider what time frame is needed. So thank you for that. I am going to suggest that we move to the next item on the agenda, but I do want to note, as usual, that we're happy to have other discussions with any of you. If you have other thoughts about engagement, or if you even just want to check in, feel free to give one of us a call. We're happy to talk. Before we go on, Phil and Sarah, I forgot to introduce someone who's on the call with us today. We have Lee Einsweiler from Code Studio. He is one of our zoning expert on our team. He is on the call today to sit in and listen about this discussion. Obviously, housing tools extend beyond zoning, but that is one piece of the discussion. So Lee, would you like to briefly introduce yourself?
Yes, I think you said it all, though. So I'm Lee Einsweiler. Our firm Code Studio is out of Austin, Texas. We're experiencing a lot of the same disruption you are, in spite of the fact that we're all the way down here. And so I'm grateful for the opportunity to be part of this today and get a chance to listen in and hear what people are thinking, sort of take the pulse. I appreciate that. Thanks.
Thanks, Lee. All right, Phil and Sarah, I will hand it off to you.
Sure. So Phil Cash, Sarah's going to lead off the presentation. Before we get started, want to acknowledge the point Jennifer made. I think as we go through this presentation, there'll be a lot of issues that'll come up that are very relevant to everything that's happening right now. And we're happy to spend as much time as we need discussing it. So if we don't get through this presentation, we'll set aside more time and talk more. I also would want to acknowledge that some folks were here for the previous session, but as always, some folks probably weren't able to join. That's recorded, and would ask, if you get a chance to go back and take a look at it. We spent a lot of time talking about what the issues are for housing. So affordable housing is a broad concept that covers many, many things, and we're going to spend some time recapping that, but not give those issues nearly the depth they deserve because we talked about it previously. So for those of you who were not here, encourage you to go and take a look at it. Also, echoing Jennifer's point, is we're always happy and available to have additional one-on-one conversations because there's a lot of ground to cover here. Sarah, do you want to lead things off?
Yes, and I apologize. I seem to be blocked from sharing my screen, so we're just going to bear with me for a minute, and we will pull up our presentation. But as Philip said, we're very excited to kind of build on the conversation that we had in our last session and bring you kind of the first of two parts of a conversation about the specific housing tools that might be available in order to address the housing issues that we talked about last time. Okay, let me just see if I can, perfect. All right. Let's see. Is that visible to everybody?
Mm-hmm.
Great. So as we said the last time we talked about the housing issues that were most pressing in Charlottesville. Today we're going to be talking about housing tools. And our goal is to really build a common understanding of the types of housing tools that are available to Charlottesville. That's building on a number of conversations we've had with stakeholders, including many of the people on the line today, since our last meeting, to understand the tools that have the most potential to address some of those priority issues and understand the ways in which the city is already using some of the tools that it has available to support housing and housing affordability. So our goal today is to talk about the types of housing tools that are available. We're going to start by reviewing the findings of that survey that we sent following the last steering committee meeting, and then start talking about the types of tools that are available and preview a little bit of the deeper detailed conversation that we'd like to be able to have with you at our next meeting. So for anybody who wasn't on the last meeting, we previewed and talked about 10 or 11 housing issues in Charlottesville to understand that housing affordability is really composed of a lot of different related topics. Those include rental affordability, things like gentrification, access to opportunity, and the concerns of special populations, including seniors and adults with disabilities. Following that conversation, we sent around a survey to ask what you thought were the most critical housing issues in Charlottesville, the issues that a plan could not be successful if it did not address those core priority issues. We heard back pretty overwhelmingly that racial equity, rental affordability, access to opportunity, and housing supply were the highest priority, the most critical housing issues. Housing stability was another issue that received majority support. And again, housing stability refers to households' abilities to stay in their homes, even without being concerned about eviction or foreclosure. One thing that stood out to us when we saw the results of this survey was, I think in keeping with a lot of the conversations we've already had with the steering committee and with others, there was very strong support for racial equity being the most critical issue for Charlottesville, but fairly low support for homeownership, which we recognize this is a complicated tangle of issues, and we had asked for the most critical. So I think we're pretty clear that you can't address racial equity without addressing homeownership, but it seems like the focus is not on homeownership in and of itself so much as homeownership as a tool to support racial equity. Do the survey results here reflect kind of, have the right issues risen to the surface? Are there any comments or questions that haven't been reflected here?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's just thing is like when we put this out, we spent a lot of time talking about the means for each one. Is like racial equity scoring top, given the origin, the reason this plan was put forward, wasn't surprising to us. But what at least I think we partially saw in the responses was people defining what the plan would actually have to address to advance racial equity varied. So like there were definitely survey respondents, viewed racial equity as a top priority, but not all survey respondents who viewed racial equity as a top priority thought gentrification was necessarily a top priority. Not all survey respondents who thought racial equity was a top priority thought homeownership. So there was a variety of, this is helpful and helps gives us some insight, but obviously these are complex issues that are interconnected and doesn't tell us exactly what you all are thinking. And we're also surveying beyond, we're surveying the general public, because while you are our committee and we care very, very much what you say and are going to take that into careful consideration, we also want to try to reach a broader audience and make sure we're hearing what they have to say. But just going back to Sarah's point, are these results surprising to anyone? How, when you look at these results, what is your takeaway?
Well, I think for me, the racial equity of rental, all of the ones that are up there but what is surprising to me, if you were doing the survey, I feel like if we were completely doing the survey in my low income, extremely low income neighborhood, gentrification would be much higher.
Mm-hmm.
If there was a saturation of this survey being done, if it wasn't the COVID and we were on the ground doing that, I would think that gentrification would be much higher especially for Charlottesville, because our neighborhood changed. It seems like it changed overnight while we're sleeping. So that's just my thought. But I think, the racial equity it is number one in the city of Charlottesville.
I think that racial equity entails a lot of the components that you have here. And I know that in our small group of homeowners, a lot of the individuals who spoke up, who have been in Charlottesville for the longest amount of time, who have had generational poverty, and their main focus was home ownership opportunity and tying all of these topics to home ownership in order to lift yourself out of a lot of these situations. So I'm very surprised that that is further on down the list.
That's helpful to hear. And I think something we see often when we have these conversations is different community organize and prioritize in this way. And while we want to make sure like the numbers give us information, this isn't a situation where just because something's scored low on the list doesn't mean we shouldn't address it. So I want to, like, we put the box around it just because that's where the majority was. I don't want to give the impression that anything below the box is falling out of the plan. That's part of why we're having this conversation. So that's helpful pushback both on the gentrification and the home ownership piece, that those are issues that you believe are essential. At least that's what I'm hearing.
So another one for me that doesn't seem to be high, which I think we, at my age, I am beginning to understand that a lot of what get built in our community is not for people aging in place. It just really put the survey kind of confirms what we all been thinking, is that whatever get built in the city of Charlottesville is for young people. It's not for people aging in place.
I can speak some to that, is that it is actually more expensive to build for housing that is for aging in place. It takes a larger square footage because you normally want a one level home for aging in place, and that square footage tends to cost more, and that could be tied into more of zoning issues. But and I see in the more higher price range communities that is what they're building more for, but less in the lower income housing area. And when the price goes up in housing in terms of price, purchase price, you do see more availability for individuals to age in place, but very few for the lower echelon of more affordable housing. Because it's more expensive, it requires more square footage. So it is less feasible for the builders to build in that regard.
Okay. That's helpful. So we're going to talk about this more, but are there other points before we move to the next slide? And again, I guess one thing that we'll be sending, Sarah, make sure I got this right, but we're going to be sending some questions and survey around after this. So, please raise your hand and talk, but also type in questions and also respond and send us comments afterwards. So we're happy to, take feedback as you have time to sit with this or other things occur to you. Or if you just don't want to say in a group setting, sometimes there are things we want to say that we don't necessarily want to say in front of everybody.
Absolutely.
We want to hear those things too.
Great.
Next slide. So kind of building on what's on the previous slide about the housing goals, we've been calling this an affordable housing plan. And that might be the right name, and we don't have to we're not going to necessarily solve this question right now, but the name of a plan we think is really important for a couple of reasons. One, when you're explaining it and talking to other people in the community, what they immediately think it's about and what therefore they narrow their thinking to what they're solving for gets set in the name. So if you tell somebody you're dealing with a plan that's about equitable housing, they're thinking about different things. They're thinking about inequity and injustice, as opposed to an affordable housing. Most people immediately think about subsidized housing. Housing strategies, there's lots of different names we can put in this, but we wanted to spend some time and start to get some feedback on this conversation about somewhat the purpose of the plan overall, and I'll start a little bit of thoughts on how we want to name it, how we want to be talking about it in the community. I know, RHI and Bricks and Story have been spending a lot of time for the overall effort about the naming, and want to make sure that we don't just default to affordable housing plan, that we make sure that we're more reflective of. There was a lot of intention and purpose from Charlottesville about when you came and asked for this plan, and there's a lot of intentions and purpose in the procurement process you went through. I want to make sure we don't lose that intention when we just when we name it. I don't know if any of you actually, when you talk about this, do you have a name for it, or has anyone given thought to that issue, how this should be named?
This is Emily Dreyfus with Legal Aid and On-FAR's Advisory Council. We have been talking about it as the affordable housing strategy because that is the crisis that we understood this was meant to address. One thing I would just be a little cautious about, if it gets a really concise name like a racial equity housing plan, is that it could get approved and then the politicians might say, well, we don't just need a racial equity housing plan, we also need an affordability housing plan, or we also need a renters housing plan. And I wouldn't want to see this get overlooked or watered down.
Okay.
Lyle Soliates, Planning Commission. In the discussions I was a part of, the big idea that I kept hearing again and again was comprehensive and integrated, which are both terrible words, but I think they're helpful ideas.
Terrible words because they're overused, but yep. Okay.
How about housing for all?
Hello?
We can hear you, Susan.
Hi. I'm here because I'm representing the downtown area. And the reason they asked to be part of this discussion, and quite often they aren't part of the discussion, is that they're finding there's more and more need for affordable housing downtown. And they're finding that there are some, low-income housing a block from the main mall. More is anticipated, that there's a plan in front of City Council where the house where some retail used to be. And I'm wondering if you are looking at comprehensively, how will you affect zoning in that 10-block area? Will mixed use, affordable housing over retail, and some open space, some that is available, and just wondered if people have considered those types of things. Thank you.
So we're going to get into the tools, but we are looking at land use and zoning. That is one of the areas of tools, and we have some great land use. We have some expertise at HRNA on land use, but we have some even better land use experts on this call. They'll also be involved in later phases.
So I like the idea of the comprehensive idea that's been mentioned, if that's a possibility.
Okay.
That actually sets us up pretty well for the next part of the conversation. So I'm going to move ahead. But as with the entire presentation, we welcome your thoughts either in this forum or through a survey or email follow-up afterward.
So, Susan, that was a great setup. So generally when we come into affordable housing, we're looking at a community, we try to think of it as to a comprehensive approach. And we look at really 3 areas or types of tools. So land use and regulation, so the municipal regulations and zoning authority that control how much gets built. And this indirectly improves affordability by increasing supply is one way you can take land use. So just increasing the supply, meaning supply and demand issues. And you can also directly incentivize or require affordability through things like inclusionary zoning. So we generally take the baseline view is that you can't address your housing affordability issues if you don't address your land use issues. But just addressing your land use issues won't solve all of your affordability issues, not even close. But you can't really get at the problem as long as you continue to live in we continue to have a free market economy, which I think is somewhat in question given everything going on right now. But if you have a free market economy, then those with more money are going to be able to outbid for housing. So how do you start to actually address the supply side? And that's what the land use said. So we believe it is a foundational piece. The next tool we really start to look at is subsidy. So, the subsidy is, it can be below. There's a whole world of affordable housing finance, which I grew up in, and is really complicated. And we play fun financial games with mezzanine debt and tax credits. And some of you on here are probably experts on it too. It's wonderful. It's extremely complicated. But fundamentally, it comes down to dealing with the issue of housing costs a certain amount to create, and households, because income policies in the US, households often make an income that's lower than that, and how do you close that gap? And for lower income households, there's no way, no land use policy, there's no way to close that gap outside of subsidy, or a wage policy, which we're not looking at wage policies as much. A wage policy could also close it. And then we look at tenants' rights. And tenants' rights are about preserving existing affordable housing, but also just providing housing stability. They primarily rest on laws and regulations that protect current and sometimes future occupants. And you can't have an affordable housing policy, effective affordable, without tenants' rights, because there will always be gentrification pressure in some areas. And without tenants' rights, that gentrification pressure largely remains unchecked. There will always be some forms of income disruption. Without tenants' rights, people's housing security is greatly threatened. So while tenants' rights alone can't solve, like you could have rent control everywhere and that alone wouldn't solve your housing challenges, you can't have, an affordable housing strategy that doesn't include tenants' rights. We basically take the view that you have to have land use, you have to have subsidy, and you have to have tenants' rights. There's nowhere in America that it's actually easy to use all these three things, and there's nowhere in America that's actually effectively using all these things yet. So if you ask me where the best example is America, until a few weeks ago, I probably would have said Minneapolis, but clearly they're falling well short of where they need to be. So next slide.
Philip, I'm sorry, real quick, just because I see a question in the chat box from one of the steering committee members. Navarre just asked, is eliminating R1 zoning in the city on the table? Are there restrictions on what can be done because of the Dillon rule?
You guys are asking the best questions because you just set the next slides. So what we're really going to do is, okay, I just talked about these tools at the highest level. We're going to go into specific examples, and we're going to look at, are they aligned with your goals and priorities? So would this tool actually advance your issue? So inclusionary zoning is a policy that requires affordable units as part of new construction. And a lot of places ask us to look at it. We look at it all the time. It's not a very good tool for preservation or anti-displacement. So we want to make sure, we want to think about, is the tool actually in line with your goals? Then we think about whether it's feasible. And feasibility is going to include both financial feasibility, but also political feasibility, legal feasibility, and we'll get into this in more detail. So I think that R1 question we're going to get back, we're definitely going to look at it. Whether it turns out to be feasible or not, I think will be a different question. And then we're going to look at impact. You have a housing challenge that's impacting thousands of households in your community. If we come up with solutions that only help dozens, that's not a comprehensive plan. That's not a plan that we can all be proud of. So we're going to look at the alignment with your goals, we're going to look at feasibility, and we're going to look at impact.
And what we're going to do now basically is walk through what we mean by each of these things and provide a little bit of detail about the types of land use tools and subsidy tools and tenants' rights tools that we've been talking about and thinking about. And then we have a bit of homework for everybody. We've got a lot more detail on all of those tools. We don't want to overload you with information, but one of the things that we're going to ask you to do coming out of this meeting is to help us answer some of those key questions. So I'm actually going to turn it over to Mary, who's going to talk a little bit about how we've started to answer some of these questions and where we're going to be asking for some additional input.
So kind of breaking down the feasibility portion, which is where we're going to do a lot of our analysis. We've kind of broken that down into these 5 different dimensions of feasibility. First is market feasibility. So does this tool actually work within the local Charlottesville market? Second is legal feasibility. So can the tool be really legally implemented based on local, state, and federal regulations? Third is political feasibility. So would the local community actually support the passage of whatever this tool is? Fourth is the degree of funding capacity, whether there's adequate funding to implement this tool, how much funding is even required to deliver, incremental units of impact. And then finally, there's organizational capacity. So are there enough kind of staff and partners and people to really carry out the implementation of this plan effectively? And so, yeah.
No, go ahead, Mike, sorry.
Go ahead.
So I think we're going to go through this. We'll find a lot of these tools aren't feasible or have barriers to feasibility. That doesn't mean we don't move forward with the tool. So if we look at the market feasibility and we see that the market in one neighborhood is not strong enough to move forward with it, then we'll look at, is it possible to design the tool to work in other neighborhoods? If it's not politically feasible because there's not support, then we'll look at examples and talk about examples where there's been coalition building and activity to actually advance a tool like that. If we find that there's not sufficient funding, we'll talk, there's always going to be not sufficient funding, then we'll talk about, what are the different fiscal tools you could raise that funding and what are the right ways to come at it. And we often work to create new organizations or build organizational capacity to implement. By definition, if you're doing something you haven't done before, you probably don't have the organizational capacity. But none of these, even legal feasibility doesn't mean it's an absolute roadblock, but we need to understand what these are, because what we don't want to give you is a plan that describes a bunch of great things that aren't actually feasible, can't actually be implemented in your market, won't actually happen. Those plans are super easy to write and no one reads them and they don't matter.
So we talked a little bit about land use tools already. When we talk about land use tools, we talk about both indirect tools, which are tools that basically set the regulatory environment such that developers come and build things. So when we talk about what's allowable by right, when we talk about allowing accessory dwelling units, that's all sort of indirectly impacting housing affordability, indirectly impacting housing supply by allowing people to build things. When we talk about direct tools, we might talk about things that are maybe slightly more targeted towards the production of affordable units. So for instance, the city might use particular incentives or inclusionary zoning measures to require or incentivize the provision of affordable housing units specifically. Phil, do you want to talk a little bit about sort of the pros and cons? I think you've already talked about it a little bit. Was there anything else that you wanted to make sure that we?
Yeah, I'll jump in a little. And one thing I acknowledge, so we're hitting a bunch of things at a relatively high level, and I apologize for that. Like we have, like Sarah talked about your homework. There are detailed slides on each of these tools in here. What we didn't want to go through, and Sarah was very right to point out, is like we didn't want us to just read you a description of each one of these, the by right zoning or building code reform or accessory dwelling units. We do want to get into some of those in depth as you guys raise hand and have questions, but we didn't want to go through them one by one because it would be overwhelming and dull. I mean, I think the key issue with land use is like land use basically lets the market react and solve the problems that the market's capable of solving. So if it's easier to develop, then the cost of development, more land can be developed at higher density, then the cost of development goes down. If there's more supply, then rents don't rise as fast and home prices don't rise as fast. I mean, you all have seen, you're a very desirable community that has very constrained land use, and that's part of the reason prices have risen so quickly. The negative side of that, and I think, there was a mention of neighborhood associations. More permissive land use means less neighborhood control. That I don't want to be around the bush. Now there's ways to have a bit of both, so you can set design standards. There's ways, but more permissive land use means more development, and means less ability for neighborhoods to block that development. The other big limitation that's on the right side here is like your lowest income households under $30,000 a year, land use tools don't really help them a whole lot. And in fact, if you don't pair land use tools with tenants' rights, you can actually lead to the displacement, the redevelopment and displacement, and actually make things worse. So land use is a great tool, but if you have a land use, I'm going to pick on Texas because I do a fair amount of work there and they're an easy target. In Houston, there's not a lot of land use restrictions. If you're live in a low-income neighborhood, near Buffalo Bayou, which is a nice park that's just become nicer there, people can buy up there's no land use restrictions. People can buy single-family neighborhoods up lower income neighborhoods, development higher density, and displace everyone in that neighborhood. Displace all the renters. Because there's both no restriction on land use and no tenants' rights, the ability of market pressure to do massive displacement is much greater. So land use can be a real positive, but without careful checks, it can also be a negative. And so we don't want to, but also I think would be grossly remiss in skipping over, addressing land use. Land use has played a major role in Charlottesville and every community in America and reinforcing racial segregation. Land use has its origin in, land use is not an evil thing, but certainly had some evil uses and it was originally created. Those uses have not gone away. So I don't mean by originally created to imply that land use isn't currently abused to reinforce racial segregation, because I think that certainly is true. So there's a historical context of land use that you can't separate out. You shouldn't pretend isn't there. We talked about this some in the previous presentation, but if you just look at the land in Charlottesville, and Sarah, Mary, you did this analysis, so you should speak to it, but R1 dominates the acreage, right? So that makes it hard for the market to respond.
Yeah, and I think we've had a number of conversations with city staff, with stakeholders, again, with people on this steering committee, and we have heard very clearly, we know land use is a key issue in Charlottesville, and it will be a key issue for the housing plan. We've seen a lot of the ways in which, both on the multifamily side and on the single family side, existing land use policies and regulations can be a barrier to the development of housing. So that's just something that we know is going to be a part of the plan. So we're going to talk a little bit, as I said, kind of some high level detail. There was a question about, is eliminating R1 zoning on the table? As of right now, yes, it's something that we want to talk about and really understand to what extent it is possible. So the tools that are sort of come right to the top of our list and that we'd like to talk about more, and then again, we've provided more detail about, and we'll provide to you for your homework reading, are changing multifamily by right zoning to allow and encourage the provision of more housing in areas already zoned for multifamily, or perhaps expanding the areas that are zoned to allow multifamily. Single family density, we call soft density. So that's either eliminating R1 or changing R1 zoning or changing other single family zoning districts to increase the types of housing allowed. That means more townhouses, duplexes, accessory dwelling units. We call it soft density. There's a lot of other terms for it. It can be a contentious issue, and we'd really like to talk about it. Accessory dwelling units, sort of part of the soft density tool, but also a tool kind of unto themselves. And then inclusionary zoning, which is a program that offers either incentives, outright financial incentives, or things like density bonuses to developers in exchange for them providing some affordable housing as a part of new market rate development. So we'd like to open it up for discussion about land use in particular right now. Is this the right starting point list? Are there other tools that we should be adding? And what potential barriers do you see to this list or to other tools that you want to talk about? I can see there's some chats coming in. I don't know if LaToya or Jenny or someone else is able to kind of field the chats.
Sorry, that last one was from me. Just reminding people that the chat box is available, as you saw in the last round of meeting notes. We'll include those comments in the chat box in the notes. So if you don't have a question, maybe you just have an idea, feel free to include it, or if you have a question. But let's see, there was a comment. Obviously, we heard Navarro's comment about R1 zoning, which has been addressed.
And does everybody understand? So R1 is single family. So just, I think everyone's pretty intuitive, but I know like whenever we're guilty of technical speak or starting to use acronyms, like just stop us and tell us to quit it. And we'll happily explain everything, what we mean by things. like when we say by right, we mean that it's not a contingent, so it's not a discretionary approval that someone could buy that piece of land and develop it without getting any discretionary approvals. Now that's the most extreme. There's this whole spectrum of levels of zoning approval. So by right's one extreme, and entirely contingent is the other extreme. Are there other tools that are being discussed in Charlottesville that we don't have on here that should be considered?
Just a few that the Planning Commission has talked about. Dimensional restrictions, height, setback, step back, side setback, all that sort of dimensional stuff that says what building envelope is permitted, and parking.
Sure. And so for the dimensional restriction conversation you all are having, is there a particular zoning district that's zoning type that's coming up in, or is that all? Is that just a universal?
We didn't get to that granularity.
Okay. Gotcha. And then parking. Go ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to say, as part of the multifamily by right conversations, we're including not just increasing where multifamily is allowed by right, but increasing some of those restrictions on whether it's by dimensions or by dwelling units per acre, which is a common measure of residential density, increasing how much density and how much residential development can actually be built.
And I want to acknowledge a comment from Roy about, again, the racial history of zoning is R1 wasn't originally just single family. That's something that got downzoned after the Civil Rights Act passed, which I think is a good, not a good illustration, but a clear illustration of how land use has been misused.
I have a question about the accessory dwelling units, and I know that the city has a policy allowing them, but I don't understand right now where that right is deployed in the city, if it's concentrated in certain neighborhoods, or how many properties can be developed with accessory dwelling units. Do you all have that information?
We do, though there are definitely people on the call who have way more information about it than we do. But yes, my understanding is accessory dwelling units are allowed in some single family neighborhoods, but there's restrictions on where they can be in terms of their location relative to where the university is. And there's also some restrictions on the dimensions of the lot, the size of the unit, and things like that that can sort of limit which where they can be built legally.
Yeah, because it seems like an attractive option, but my sense is that people in Charlottesville have not really gone after it or pursued it. I mean, individual homeowners don't seem to have built that many. So yeah. I just wonder if in the end it's really a useful tool or not.
I think that's exactly the question we're going to want to get into a little bit more analysis. So we've looked at ADU policies in other places, and we've seen a number of barriers. One is just lot size and setback requirements. Like Charlottesville has a lot of small lots. Even with a relatively modest setback requirement, you might knock out most lots. That's one set of issues that we see people knocked out. Sometimes we see parking requirements that knock it out. Other times we see it's just complicated. Like it's a major construction project, and most households don't have the sophistication or access to the financial markets to undertake it. And so we see real barriers there. So we're going to be doing some more digging into what some of those obstacles are, and then trying to come back to you all with, if you expand this out, what would that actually, like, what's a realistic expectation? 20 units a year, 10 units a year? And if you got those units a year, income-wise, who would we really be serving here? And we can't give you perfect answers, but we can try to give you scale and general direction. You know, I think it's a great tool, but it's a great tool because it's a relatively low cost, but there are also real limitations on the number of units and the income, the depth of the affordability.
We have a hand raised from Michael Payne.
Has his hand. Yep.
Yeah, I guess you touched on it a little bit, but I think one of the big discussions locally around land use is just the fact that land use changes don't impact neighborhoods equally. So I don't even know if it's possible, but just trying to like get an analysis of what land use changes could mean more neighborhood by neighborhood in terms of, you know, the amount of new investment comes in and that displacing people. Because I know there's a lot of conversation around like if you made land use changes to allow more density in like a really wealthy neighborhood that's all single family homes, there's no real risk of displacement there. Whereas if you built, you know, or if you allowed land use change for more density in a lower income neighborhood, it's probably going to be because of construction costs, more expensive units going at 1,500 plus a month, which can create displacement pressures. And then from the political side, I think, well, one of the biggest difficulties currently with land use is our special use permit process, which drives a lot of opposition to projects. And I think it's a very complex question that varies project by project, neighborhood by neighborhood, but I don't think, you know, politically, we fully grappled with the dynamics of like special use permits and what that creates versus what will get built by right.
Yeah, and I think we've spent a little bit of time already kind of getting into understanding the city's special use permit process and the ways in which it is and is not facilitating multifamily currently. I'm going to move on, I think, unless there are other comments on that.
Observation on the accessory dwelling units. We have a handful in my neighborhood, and the ones I'm familiar with were all used as vehicles to allow for multi-generational. You know, the younger family unit has the main house, and elderly relatives live in the accessory. So it's not really a, you know, it's more about a aging in place, I guess, more than providing additional housing.
Sure.
Sarah and Phil, sorry, there's also a comment from S. Lisa, or a question, would form-based code be a part of this conversation? And Lyle also asked about design review.
Form-based code can absolutely be part of the conversation. It's not something we usually get as deep into on the affordability side, but definitely don't want to close the door on it.
Well, I think because we have the opportunity to work with Code Studio and to get some of the more specific zoning code update type recommendations, they have the expertise to help kind of think through what those changes might look like in more detail than I think we would probably cover in the housing plan. Is that fair? All right, I'm going to move on to subsidy. Subsidy, when we talk about subsidy, we talk about both capital subsidies or funding to reduce the cost to either develop or acquire housing, and we talk about operating subsidies, which are basically ongoing payments to either a property owner or a tenant in order to support a lower or a more affordable rent. Subsidy is much more so than land use, directly targeted to affordability. It can even be directly targeted to affordability at particular income levels. And as we've heard repeatedly in Charlottesville, we know that households at 50% of the median income, 30% of the median income are really a crucial area of focus and need for affordable housing. Subsidy is fairly capital intensive for the public sector, but it also can be used to leverage private funding in order to support both development and, in some cases, the operations of new buildings. So when we talk about Charlottesville and subsidy, as I said, we know we've heard that there's a significant gap, particularly for households at 50% and 30% of area median income. There's a number of programs that Charlottesville is already deploying. Both the city and other sources provide rental assistance vouchers for households to afford rent throughout the city. CRHA is in the process of modernizing and replacing its public housing units. And we've talked to them to understand kind of their process and the ways in which they're using low-income housing tax credits to do that work. We know that the city and some other local funders are providing gap financing for low-income housing tax credit projects, and that the city set aside some other funding, although of course we know that the budget is not now what it was even a month or two ago. Philip, did you want to say something on subsidy?
No, I think the biggest thing is like subsidy, again, as we started at the beginning, subsidy is essential. It's just extremely expensive, as Sarah was saying. So the rule of thumb, and this varies some between about $15,000 to $20,000, but it takes about $15,000 to $20,000 to reduce rent by $100 for just one unit. So if you need to knock rent down $400, $500 for a household to be able to afford it, you need somewhere between $75,000 and $100,000 to do that. You start talking about thousands of units, it becomes extremely capital intensive. And so, there's things to do to leverage federal funding, leverage other funding sources, but it's a real limitation and challenge. We can't subsidy, like I live in DC where, Latoya, you'll know this better. I think we're $130 million annually and local housing trust funds. So the city is taxing itself to the tune of an extra $120 million and a city of 600,000. So we're not that big. And it's still well short, like well, not even a tenth of what we need.
And of course, federal funding for housing programs has been declining nationwide over the last couple of decades. So cities around the country are increasingly having to come up with the funding to meet that need. There are a significant number of potential solutions on the subsidy side, some of which the city is already deploying, some of which would be potentially new. We've broken them out by capital and operating just because there is kind of a large number of them. Low-income housing tax credits, again, I don't want to throw around too much jargon, but LIHTC or low-income housing tax credits, both 4% and 9% tax credits are the primary vehicle for the production and preservation of subsidized affordable rental housing around the country. There are restrictions on how much they can, basically there's limits to how many units LIHTC can support every year, but that remains a major source of funding. Public housing, of course, we've talked about CRHA is modernizing its housing currently. We can talk about preservation. So that's dedicating funding in order to preserve the affordability of what we call naturally occurring affordable housing, as well as subsidized affordable housing that is maybe expiring and at risk of becoming market rate. We can talk about using a community land trust, which would basically separate the ownership of the land from the ownership of the home in order to kind of manage resale values and keep properties affordable for a longer period of time. And then we can talk about subsidy not just for large multifamily projects, but also for individual single-family homes when we talk about down payment assistance and other supports to get households into homeownership. So those are the sort of capital upfront subsidy tools that we think we're likely to be talking about for Charlottesville. Have we missed anything? Are there other tools that we should be talking about here?
Or are there tools that we put up here that aren't clear that you'd like us to talk about more? These are clear to us. We know we're covering them quickly.
I would just add, this is Jen from AHIP. We do rehab and repair in Charlottesville. I would just add, expand preservation a little bit to talk about existing homeowners as well. So we serve low-income homeowners in Charlottesville who don't need to get into a home but need help with their existing home, and that often comes in the form of critical repair and rehabilitation work. So the grants that is all grant driven. There really aren't, we haven't found a feasible way to use loan funds with that because the people we help tend to be very low income. so their ability to pay back is diminished. So it's largely grant driven. I have seen in other communities a pairing of rehab projects, rehab programs like ours with community land trust, especially there's one in somewhere in the Midwest, I'm not sure where, Ohio, I think, where they they target seniors who want to hold on to their homes, and they end up conveying their property to a land trust and getting critical rehab in exchange, and can live there and then still own the house and can sell the house. So they preserve some of their wealth, but the house remains affordable in perpetuity. So anyway, that's all to say. I would just add that in terms of pairing with down payment assistance and rental preservation, talk about owner-occupied preservation as well.
Sure. So we can definitely add owner-occupied rehab, and we've worked on the connection between community land trust and owner-occupied rehab in Detroit a little bit. I think it's a tough one to balance, but
it's
a really good, the right goal, letting people stay in their homes while also preserving the affordability and their wealth.
Yeah, well, it hits, the survey, it hits equity, it hits gentrification, it hits housing stability, it sort of encompasses a lot of that.
Yep.
Yeah.
No, very, very helpful recommendation. Thank you.
Thanks.
Just another thing we've done is look at taxes and fees, and if people are having income problems, or if there's an affordability component, there's a revision there.
And just on that, is that work out more on back taxes, or is that abatement or refund on lowering their current tax rate, or a combination thereof?
Sorry, you cut out. Can you say that again?
Sorry, is that been focused on a workout or forgiveness of back taxes owed, or about changing their tax rate, what they're paying going forward, or both? Sorry, is it not working on my side? I'm sorry.
Actually, I was muted.
I'm not sure.
I don't recall the details.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, we're happy to dig into it. Definitely, definitely fiscal policy. Yeah, taxes can be a really important lever.
And Philip and
Go
Sarah,
ahead.
we had a comment in the chat box from S. Lisa regarding the statement was, the funding amount that is used to keep people in public housing is outrageous and not a way out of poverty. Redevelopment of public housing is not a new solution, but more of the same old story.
So on public housing redevelopment, I think that there's a couple pieces that I want to break that into some pieces. One is the costs for housing, situation where a household basically can't support, they don't have the income to support any private debt. So I talked about the, basically for every $100, it takes about $20,000 in subsidy. So if you have a household that's got less than $20,000 in income, maybe an income level of 0, disabled, whatever it is, for whatever reason, they don't have income, the cost to house them, whether you do it in public housing or another housing model, is extremely high. So that, there's a cost there that is just extremely high, period, whether it's public housing or not. So I want to put that one piece aside. Next, there's an issue with households that, if you don't have an income that actually even supports the operating costs, so the cost to pay taxes, the cost to do repairs, the cost to have insurance on the property.
Hand me a knife
that's
and
also,
fix me some hot tea and put it in here, please.
Joy, we can hear you. We want the tea too.
There's water on the floor, something leaking.
Joy?
Joy, we can hear you. There you go. Got her. So there's a real cost to that. I acknowledge that. Whether public housing, there are plenty of public housing authorities that have not been great stewards of public funding. I'm not going to take a position on Charlottesville because I just don't have the knowledge. But when you go back and look at the model historically, a lot of the failures on public housing have been related to basically systemic underfunding. If you don't pay to maintain something, or you design it to be concentrated poverty in an area without any amenities or any services, it generally isn't going to work. So when you say the public housing, when someone says the public housing model is failed, I think that's a very valid statement. The public housing model where we don't give enough money and we concentrate poverty and it's low quality housing to begin with doesn't work. The issue hasn't been, at least in my professional experience, that you could have done things a lot cheaper. it's generally actually been the opposite way around. Is like society hasn't been comfortable bearing the full cost. That's actually part of the reason housing authorities exist. It was to take the financial responsibility for low-income households, and move it off of the federal government and move it off of local governments onto a special quasi-public entity that could then be moved off balance sheet. So yeah, definitely want to be careful and very thoughtful about how we approach public housing redevelopment. So there's new programs, rental assistance demonstration. There's a lot of new approaches to how to redevelop in terms of mixed income. But don't want to give anybody the impression here that we think that there's a low-cost solution for providing safe, quality housing in neighborhoods of opportunity for extremely low-income households. It's going to be, it's expensive. So that was a very long answer and hopefully somewhat helpful, and please push back.
I would just add to that, you know, the potential for, you know, leveraging funds through public housing redevelopment is really substantial and actually a really good use of money. If you look at just the first 2 phases of redevelopment, you've got a total replacement of 163 public housing units, which, you know, get an operating subsidy and very little capital attached to that. The funding that's making that happen is the LIHTC. And then the additional, you know, to be able to use that LIHTC responsibly, yeah, there's outside sources, which is really good. But on top of those 163, there's an additional 116 brand new affordable housing units for the city of Charlottesville, which is way more than anybody else is doing. And I think that's pretty amazing and really cool and a really good use of public funds. When you look at 30% below AMI, there is no way the market can handle any of that without a really big subsidy, and it's just going to have to happen. And, you know, I think CRHA has done a good job of going out and finding a bunch of money that didn't come directly from Charlottesville, and then work with the city to do the gap financing. I think it's a really good thing.
And this is Michael again. Just a couple quick things. One, I don't know if it would quite fall under subsidy, but something that the city is a land bank, which could potentially be used to get more.
We lost you, Michael.
Sorry, I think you faded out a little bit.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. One is I don't know if it's quite a subsidy, but in the city we've discussed creating a land bank, which could potentially be used to get land under the control of nonprofits or community land trust. 2, I think an important subsidy component is energy and utility bills, especially for our mobile home residents. Some of them pay $300 or more a month in those bills. 3, a major challenge we found with low-income housing tax credits is some of those projects were not structured well, and because there is a set affordability period, they are online to become flipped and become market rate, which will be a huge loss of existing units. And the 4th and final thing, something Brandon sort of mentioned is, I think in terms of providing local subsidy, we have a lot more leeway if it's bondable to provide that subsidy. And public housing, because of CRHA, is bondable. And just looking at, are there any other things that could be created or ways to make other projects bondable, because that just makes that subsidy a lot more feasible at a bigger level.
Those are all helpful points. On the land banking piece, one, I know we got to keep moving, but on the one type of capital subsidy we don't have in here called out, but is an important one that we can include is publicly owned land. Whether you're buying it and land banking it or whether it's already publicly owned, it's something that's come up in conversations. It comes up in every conversation, every place we work. And I think, you know, publicly owned land in the broadest sense of the word. So publicly owned in the sense of owned by your local government, but also by your housing authority and even by mission-based organizations. So, you know, we often do a lot of work with houses of worship. You have a university that owns a fair amount of land. There's often opportunities with those pieces to put that in. And Sarah, I want to let us talk about operating subsidy.
Yeah.
So I just want to interject what Michael and Brandon have said, but I just want to interject that there is a responsibility on the localities also, even though public housing is in the city. And so over the years that I have traveled and see and understand what was happening, there is a responsibility to the local community to also support innovation idea like what we're doing, to be able to support low and extremely low housing, because we do have low and extremely low people in our community. So whether and Section 8 is a subsidy. And I just want everybody to understand where I'm coming from. Section 8 funding every year, you know it, Philip, you know it, Sarah, because you all work across this country, just like I have worked across this country with the National Low Income Coalition, is on the chopping blocks every year to be defunded. Every year we have to fight. Every year I walk with my walking stick and other residents to beg and to make absolutely sure that Section 8 subsidy is still there. So that's the public housing also. That's public housing also. So if that subsidy go, it is going to be devastated. So I think we all have to wrap our head around that we do have to make sure that when we are planning anything, that we are serving people from 0 up to 60% of the AMI. Or else people are just, you're gonna have a homeless population. And public housing, I will give you that. No, it haven't been run properly across this country. But some have done some good things with it. You know what I'm saying? Rehabbing. RAD, I don't support RAD. And the reason I don't support RAD is because what a lot of people don't understand is that when you sign a lease in public housing, you get more rights as a tenant on top of the residence right that you talked about in your other slide, to be able to organize, to be able to be involved in stuff, and to be able to do what those residents are doing. So I just needed to project that to let you know that yes, I do agree with you, but you have to look at different ways of how you still serve low and extremely low. I am so sick and tired of hearing y'all say, oh, it's too expensive to do this. Oh, it's too expensive to do that. Low income people, works at McDonald's, clean y'all clothes, take care of your parents. You know, they're RNs, they're CNAs, so we have to provide houses for them. If I sound like I'm passionate about it, I am, because I have traveled this country to see what this is all about. It's about reclaiming our land that they didn't want. And so that's why we're fighting in Charlottesville, to make sure that we maintain the 376 public housing units that we have, and also to provide more affordable housing for the least of the least. Thank you.
So that was, Joy, that was really helpful to hear. And I want to make sure I particularly call out that the comment made earlier about the public housing, the question about whether public housing is a failed model. I think there have been, acknowledging has been headstrong, but to Joy's point, that the rights that come with public housing and the level of income it serves hasn't been replicated anywhere else. And I think that's a big, like when you hear people push to maintain public housing, I think that's a big part of what's at the table here. We talked about operating subsidy. So we have tenant-based vouchers, which is more of a technical way to say Section 8. So this is rental assistance, long-term ongoing rental assistance. Operating subsidy of some form or another is necessary if you're going to serve households at around 30% AMI or lower. Sometimes around 40, but right at that income level, because the income levels, the salaries are not high enough, wages are not high enough to cover the cost of housing, you have to give additional ongoing support to cover that gap. Even if you lower the cost of the building, so you put subsidy into the building, it's not enough. And Joy's point is correct. basically, as long as I've been alive, the amount of funding has gone down. There's a couple of years where it went up a little bit, but on average, it's declined 40 years. And that, the need hasn't declined. And that's left local governments more to try to cover that burden, and housing authorities more to cover that burden. So, we know that you have the emergency short-term rental assistance, which is a slightly different need, is helping households that have a one-time a bump and limited financial resources to try to get through. And you've looked at a landlord risk fund to try to get landlords to accept tenant-based vouchers, so we can make sure that vouchers help households get into better neighborhoods, better properties, and there's just generally a better ability to actually use those vouchers because they only work if a landlord agrees to. And there were comments made earlier about property tax relief. So be it abatement or forgiveness or a bunch of different structures, it's really, it can be a really effective tool. It's expensive because that's property tax money that's not available to go support other things. It also can require agreement between multiple actors. Your schools and other users of property taxes often have strong feelings about that. Are there questions or comments on the operating side? I feel like we've talked about this covered it pretty well, so I don't know that we need to talk about it more, but don't want to cut anybody off.
I just want to give a quick time check. I know you're watching it too, but it's about 5:37, so just putting that out there.
Let's talk about tenants' rights then.
Phil, do you want to introduce this one?
Sure. So I guess this is like tenants' rights. Tenants' rights are probably the most difficult area for us and most of our works. We generally work, I'd say more than half of our work is in states where there aren't strong tenants' rights. Virginia is definitely one of those states. Tenants' rights are about making sure tenants have the ability to stay in their home, that actually have rights, many of the rights we would normally only associate with homeowners. Some on the more extreme side, you might think this as rent control, but it's also just right to counsel. So your landlord's not making repairs or doing things they're supposed to do, they're not upholding their side, that you actually have the ability to push back. It's the ability, it's like how quick, under what circumstances evictions can occur. So things like just cause eviction. So it's both there's the support and ability to force the existing rights, even if they're not very strong rights. And then there's actually expanding tenants' rights. The biggest obstacle here is going to be, like most states south of the Mason-Dixon line, tenants' rights are not strong. Now that's changing to some extent. I think we're doing a lot of work related to COVID response. A lot of work related to COVID response in other parts of the country. We're looking at very real specter of mass evictions across the country, and think tenants' rights are getting a much closer look in places that haven't historically looked at it. And just because it's not currently legal in Virginia doesn't mean it's not something you guys should be considering or pushing on. This is most important for housing stability, both in making sure that tenants can't just be displaced, but also creating a housing market where most landlords are responsible. And meanwhile, but there are landlords that have business models that involve regular evictions and charging back fees. And you want to create a legal landscape where that's not a good business model. And so you want that strength there. The challenge in all of this is going to be what can be done within the states, within the context of the state. And right now, to enhance states' rights, there must be generally voluntary or conditions related to funding given. So for significant states' rights, for significant tenants' rights to be moved forward, you're going to need a very creative strategy, which we're happy to think with you all on, or change at the state level. We talk about some more, but I guess I just want to pause as I get into this. I know there's some of you on this call that work on tenants' rights, that help on this front. I'm curious how you're seeing those conversations work, and particularly how you're seeing those conversations right now with the specter of mass evictions, as we've seen unemployment skyrocket.
So I do wonder if there's a way to sort of creatively work around some of the state law on things like right to counsel. That would require, you know, probably a big influx of cash for legal services. But I think that's something that could really be done well. I wonder if folks have looked at the pilot programs that are going on. One in Richmond, there's a couple localities in the state that the state has allowed some eviction prevention measures in private housing. And wondering if that's something that y'all have looked at, and you know what that might look like for Charlottesville, if it was something that could be applied statewide, or that Charlottesville could try to get into the pilot program.
Others on my team may be familiar with, but I'm actually not familiar with that pilot program, but very interested.
This is Jenny. I don't believe I've heard anything about the pilot program either.
Well, off the top of my head, you know, basically it gives tenants a lot fairer shake in court for the most part. And actually some of the provisions in the pilot are similar to what CRHA actually does for its tenants. You know, it's mostly revolves around back payment of rent. But I think that's something to look into. It's been a while since I learned about this, and I don't know how well or not it's going, but
we won't quiz you on it, Brandon. We will dig into it.
Yeah,
Cool.
Lyle sent a link in the chat box as well.
Cool. And then the other is having an eviction strike fund, which again would require, you know, some money. But I think that is certainly an eviction prevention tool that is much needed in Charlottesville. And then I would just throw on the pile furthering fair housing as it relates to former felons. You know, what we're finding right now is there are people who are returning from prison and they're living with relatives, and they're probably not supposed to be, and it's a lease violation. So it's another reason to be evicted. And if there was a way to approach that, and I don't know that you could do that across the board for private housing, but this kind of notion that everybody should get a fair shake at housing, I think falls in the tenants' rights category and actually supports affordable housing, though might expand the need for it. But I think that's another thing to be considering.
Yeah, and to Brandon, that's a great one to point out, and embarrassing to have left off. We've done some work on that in New York City and other places, just making sure returning prisoners have housing options. So we can absolutely add that to the list and dig into that one because it's significant.
There were a few on this list that we've heard have met with significant barriers already, including both rent control and just cause eviction. Curious to know what people think about legal limitations and where there might be appetite for either advocacy or more creative solutions.
I think that we are so hampered by the state, and the temperatures changing gradually in Virginia, well, pretty significantly after the last election. So there's reason to be hopeful, but landlord-tenant rights are so severely on the side of the landlord in Virginia that I don't really have a ton of hope for massive change happening anytime soon. We are looking at whether the city can do an eviction moratorium. And actually, it looks like there is that right. It just is a matter of whether or not there will be the political will behind it. But under COVID, because of the state of emergency, apparently that allows localities to ask the governor for permission for certain things that would go above and beyond what normally a locality would be allowed to do. And some localities have already done this and passed eviction moratoriums in Virginia recently. So we are hopeful that that might be something that the city will take a hold of, because I'm very, very concerned about what's coming down the pike. I think the courts are still closed locally, but not for long. And we are going to see some really terrible increases in homelessness if there isn't a lot more assertive things done.
Great. Are there any other comments? I want to make sure that we have some time to talk about tenants' rights, but I also want to make sure that we respect the agenda.
This may be something that you have to put on the agenda again, because that's going to come up. I think. I don't know where this fit in, but I know that like project-based residents in Charlottesville, they're organized now, but they really don't have a covenant like public housing have, as far as a statute and a regulation. And so we're always advocating on their behalf. We even have a administrative plan that we keep our eyes on because it's a part of the consolidated plan. So, but outside of project base, Emily, it does include also Section 8 voucher holder, right?
Additional protections for Section 8 residents, is that what you're asking?
Yeah.
You know, I don't actually know too much about that, but I think there are additional protections because of the oversight of the housing authority, but that's something we could look at. And I'm sure legal aid lawyers would know that off the top of their head.
So again, that's something that, you know, even I'm a housing advocate. I just happen to live in public housing. And so that would be what I forcefully talk about. But I'm equally concerned about the rights of Section 8 residents who are in private housing and also project-based. So I don't know where it comes into this discussion. That's why I'm saying it may have to be on your agenda going forward. I don't know. So I'm just putting that out there.
So I think, I don't want to reframe creative, but one of the places there is the ability to create more tenants' rights is when there's public funding going in. And I think part of what I'm hearing is making sure we call out a point of where we're putting public funding in. Are we making higher tenants' rights part of taking that money? That's what I think I just heard you say.
Whatever protection that gives them, yes.
Got it. Okay. That's definitely something we can look at and come back to you all as a tool.
Great. I'm going to just move ahead so we can talk about some next steps and have a little bit more time for open comment. So as I've mentioned, we're going to ask the steering committee to review the detailed descriptions of the potential tools outlined in this discussion and provide some feedback, including, you know, what are the design parameters that you think are most important for us to keep in mind, and what are the feasibility barriers or opportunities that you see for each of those potential tools. Coming out of that, what we want to do at our next conversation is start to think about where the capacity exists and how we can shape an overall strategy to maximize impacts and really drill down on some specific goal setting and recommendations. So this is kind of the first part of a two-part conversation about the housing tools that will be included in the plan. I'm going to show you what the detailed tools look like real quick. This is sort of the first tool. So for each of the tools, what we've done is talked a little bit about, based on the work we've been able to do already, what is the status of the tool in Charlottesville currently? What are some things to keep in mind when we start talking about how to design a program to do this in Charlottesville? And then on the right-hand side, some preliminary assessments of the feasibility of each of those tools. And for some, we're really looking for your input. Is this something that's going to have a lot of political barriers? Is this something where there are organizations ready to go to support implementation? Trying to understand where you see the feasibility of each of these tools sitting. So that's what we'll be sending you.
Yeah. And forgive us where we've taken, even on these more detailed slides, we've taken things that are quite complicated and made them very simple. It's like organizational capacity, we say little capacity required. That's not really true. To go through a zoning approval process is quite complicated, but generally the city has a lot of the infrastructure there. So like, we're trying to give you more detail here, but not bury you in technical details. So where you have thoughts, where you have pushback, where things aren't clear, like we really want you to go through it, but we already ate an hour and a half going through these at the high level without talking them one by one. It would be another 3 or 4 hours to go with them at medium level. But we know we need to have those conversations because this is about implementation and things actually happening. And for things to actually happen, we have to get through and address these barriers. There's a reason why these things haven't already happened. And it's usually because there's multiple barriers on this list.
Great. So I'll turn it back to Jenny if you want to take over.
Happy to do that. Thanks, guys. Let's see here. We have some questions that were posed by the other people who have attended the meeting tonight. I just wanted to go through these quickly. If you're still on, let's see. It looks like we have 10 attendees who are not on the steering committee. If you want to ask other questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A or, click on, I think you can click on raise your hand and we can take you off mute. I'm going to read through the ones that we already have first. Earlier, Emily Perkins asked, are we hoping to extend the survey to university students or do we want to focus on permanent residents, of Charlottesville? And I said, the university students are certainly welcome to respond to the survey. As our, county residents, we've gotten that question a lot. Are county residents allowed to participate? And yes, Charlottesville is a lot of things to a lot of people, and we are hoping, one thing we're tracking is who we're hearing from in terms of how it matches the current population of the city. So we do want to know who lives in the city, who doesn't. That'll help us. So we're hoping that everyone who responds to the survey will, provide some of those answers to the questions toward the end that are sort of more demographic, where you live, who you are, and that'll help us with that. We had a suggestion thinking about what to call the housing plan. Melvin Burris suggested the Cville housing plan. So that's one we can consider, sort of an all-encompassing name. Jasmine Ringel asked earlier if, in addition to the recording, will we be providing slides, the slides to the public? And yes, we can post these on the website. And then there was around the ADU discussion, Lucy Middlefort asked, one thing I'm thinking about is the environmental impact of building new versus using our existing housing stock. And is there a way to structure additional ADU policies so that it encourages construction of ADUs but disincentivizes demolitions? And I saw Navarre had posted some comments on that. I think you might have just added one too. Did you want to speak to that, Navarre?
Yeah, I just had a couple things. So the place committee, we talked about ADUs a little bit back, might have been August now, I don't remember, a while back. So this may not be the most up-to-date information because it's been a couple minutes. But I know Seattle was working on, and I think they passed a change to their zoning regulations where they decreased the maximum size of a house on a lot down from, I think, 5,200 down to 2,500 square feet for the by right. I assume you could get a special use if you really, really wanted to build something bigger, but that would be a pain. So basically, disincentivizing tearing down older homes that tend to be smaller to build like a big McMansion type home because the developer can get more money for more square footage. to disincentivize that, and then also increase the amount of, I think they went from 1 to 2 ADUs you could build on the lot, and I don't remember, maybe up to 1,200 square feet for the, I don't remember the exact numbers, but it was part of their ADU revamp. They decreased the size of the actual main house that you could build on a lot.
Okay, thanks. So sort of one example related to Lucy. Did HRNA want to respond to that as well? Any additional thoughts?
No. I think this is the kind. I mean, I think this is the kind of stuff we want to get into with the code folks and recode, and because there's lots of different ways to make. Like, you can have an ADU policy, or you can have an ADU policy that actually works. And I think there's a lot of examples of people trying ADU policies and iterating and changing them over time. So I think there's a lot, like getting detailed on the code there is really important.
Great. I think I've got all those questions. Was there any attendees who want to raise their hand to ask a question or make a comment?
We have one more that's popped up in the Q&A box. Hold on one second.
Let's see. Mike Parisi asked, will there be language in the plan explicitly linking the role of the city and university in creating the affordable housing problem? Oh, I see. In creating the affordable housing problem it is now rightly trying to address, particularly for African Americans. So we have been including in the webinars, we talked very briefly because of the time, there's a lot you could talk about history, but we do touch on the fact, that the history of planning and zoning has led to some lasting issues. There are other reports out in the city that touch on that too. Click had a great one. So I think I would say, yes, we would like to include some language about that in the plan. It's been a part of the discussion from the beginning. I think on the housing plan, like, we definitely want to acknowledge that. I think we also on our side need to be careful how we frame it so that it doesn't seem like a thing that happened in the past and isn't happening at all anymore. I'm not saying necessarily the universities doing anything wrong at the present point in time, but there are, like, just the general public policy environment that's going on. Like, there are policy decisions that are made that impact different populations differently. And so, yeah, you can see right there, even I have a hard time saying it directly. So it's really important to, I think, both talk about the past, but also talk about what the consequences are of current policy. And we do want to be really clear on that, while putting people in a way to partner and address them, but be really clear that there are no neutral policies, and there's no visible magical hand in the market. Every policy advantages or disadvantages one group. Okay, thanks. Seeing no hands raised and no additional questions that have come up, I'm going to move us on to wrap up. As Phil and Sarah said, they're going to send along some more information to you all about this discussion that we just had around housing tools. And we'll be also following up with you all to share, there's obviously a public schedule that's out there. It's on the website, the schedule of this process. But we want to make sure it's clear to you how and when your input is. We're really looking to come to you to get your thoughts. And so we're going to look at clarifying that and share that with you as well. So you can expect to see that. We'll also be sharing, when we can, the summary of what we heard in May and June, and that includes not only the survey, but also the small group discussions, which have been really interesting, and sort of the Q&A from the webinars, those other discussions we've been having beyond the survey. So you'll hear more about that, but please, we've talked already about ways we can get more people information about what's going on and how they can give their input, but please, share information. You all have great networks and you're great community champions. So we appreciate you being here, and we hope you'll help us share that information as well. And we'll be reaching out to schedule another meeting. Actually, before we go, that's one quick question we had, and I think what I'll do is include this in the email that we send out, but we normally don't hold a lot of meetings like this in August, July. There's usually a lot of travel going on and whatnot. And we'd like to hear from you. Again, we don't need to talk about it now, but we'll try to reach out to you guys to figure out what that looks like this year. Is it similar this year? Might there be more of an opportunity this year and other years than to have, some meetings during the summer? So that'll be part of what we're coming to you for as well. But thank you very much. I'm very happy to be able to wrap this up at 6 o'clock. Thank you for all of you and for us. But thank you for being here, and please, stay safe in all ways.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thank you to our attendees from the public.